This is the Friends of History Debating Society. I'm Gaius, live from Londinium, and a beautiful spring evening. Germanicus is here. The centurions, retired men, are drinking heavily tonight because why not? The wine is sweet. It's a beautiful spring night. They survived 20 years in the service of Rome, and they're well financed and have beautiful farms here in Londinium at the edge of the empire. We will speak about edges of the empire tonight. Germanicus is here, and we're going to address a large topic in the 21st century, something may be uncomfortable for the assumptions that America is winning. The question at hand right now is another war in Eurasia. And we address that by saying the war started quite some time ago, but the kinetic part of it, a repeated campaign, began in these last days. Israel ostensibly going after the suspect nuclear weapons program, but the first night and several nights since then, it looks like decapitation strikes, meaning that to repeat the success of the defeat of Hamas and the defeat of Hezbollah would be to take down the leadership and then deal with the remnant that is disorganized and without strong guidance. Germanicus, a very good evening to you. I mentioned that we recently have been talking much about the struggle in Ukraine against the Russian aggression and the refusal of Ukraine to negotiate or concede or recognize its presence and its relationship to NATO is making the war very difficult for NATO, with a big meeting coming up in July. However, I also mentioned that Ukraine-Russia is only one of several conflicts in the Eurasian supercontinent, the world island. To name them, and some of them are subsets, we have Ukraine-Russia, we have Israel-Hamas, we have Israel-Hezbollah. We certainly have, well, it's quite difficult to say one person is against Syria as it was, but Syria is now a conflict of several zones going in different directions. And then, of course, the struggle against Al-Qaeda, which has elements all through the Middle East, jihadists everywhere, including the man who claims to be president of Syria. The World Island subset has ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Africa, East Africa, West Africa, the Sahel, Congo. And Uganda recently, ISIS suicide attack failed in Uganda. And then we have the conflict that you'd have to say is freshly underway, Israel against Iran. In Asia, we have North Korea participating in the Russian efforts against Ukraine, but at this point, we just don't know about North Korea and South Korea. There's been an election that favors North Korea. There could be a conflict forthcoming. And then the long-standing dispute between the United States and China over Taiwan, which is not kinetic, but everything up to it. In fact, the predicate of kinetic right now. That's enough. I don't need to break them down any more than that. There are Eurasian wars across the map. The question I put to you is the U.S. involvement in these Asian wars. Following Mackinder, the geographer who favored the British Empire 100 years ago, we are outside the world island. We are the edges of geostrategic thinking, and that our power is our Navy. We have a continent, and we possess it, and there's no challenge to it. Our Navy can project power, as we see with the carriers in the Gulf, in the Red Sea, in the Arabian Peninsula. But that is dangerous for us, perilous. And repeatedly over the last 20 or 30 years, it's been demonstrated that our carriers do not assert an authority that lasts, hence Afghanistan, hence Iraq, hence maybe even right now we're witnessing Israel. I don't know. We got into Israel's support. I think you'd have to say Truman started it, but Eisenhower, when he sent the carriers into the Med during the attempt by the British and the French and the others to take over the canal.
Israel, yeah.
and others, lots of others.
Hello.
You'd say that we got into the Gulf, we got into the Med under Eisenhower, and we've never entirely left it, but we're not very successful, at least to measure for the last 20 years. So, question I put to you is, this isn't about isolationism. This is a question about, do we have the authority, the hardware, the will to project power into a continent where Mackinder says we can stay out? Good evening to you, Germanicus.
Good evening, Gaius. The Roman, that is to say, our approach to sea power is straightforward. We needed to control the Mediterranean. We did after defeating the Cilician pirates around the time of the Servile Wars with Spartacus. And since then, it's been what later Americans would call free security. And the Roman Navy, in our time, has shifted its center of gravity to the Rhine and the Danube. We have warships, squadrons going up and down, and squadrons in the North Sea. Now, the problem for Britain when Mackinder was writing was that Britain had to, and he was writing around the turn of the century. So that at that point, Britain was being outmaneuvered by the Russian Empire. Britain always based its sea power on controlling the Mediterranean and what were called the Western approaches, which was the key to the Atlantic. If it could do both of those, then it basically could send out gunboats around the rest of the world, or second-class ironclads, and basically have total maritime supremacy. What Russia was doing, however, in 1900 was building fleets, the premier fleet being in the Far East, and suddenly Britain's position was very tenuous. And this continued. And what Mackinder was saying essentially was that if Russia was to get into the heart of Europe, then it would dominate everything. And, Russia did get into the heart of Europe in 1814, and it got into the heart of Europe again under Stalin, the man of steel, in 1945. But it never was able to turn that advantage into anything like dominance. And the fact is that as a retort, as a reply, and I think a complete condemnation of Mackinder, Nicholas Spikeman, the great American geopolitician who was writing at Yale in the 1930s and early 40s, had a very different idea of an American space, one that would be absolutely unassailable through sea power. And in his calculus, his equation, sea power could essentially dominate the world as long as the U.S. controlled the rimlands. Mackinder gave short shrift to the rimlands, meaning all the area around the world island. Whereas Spikeman said, if you use sea power to be in a position to leverage the rimlands, you will be completely safe and secure. And I think that is the pathway for the U.S. today. The U.S. cannot dominate Eurasia. Already you have the BRICS, which include Russia, India, and China, plus Iran and others, have created a kind of Eurasian mass that the U.S. really can't dominate. And our ineffectual effort to dominate the Middle East, I believe, is ending. And so it's best for the U.S. to look to the kind of Spikeman strategy in which we would oppose the world island with what we already have, which is pretty majestic, and that would be the European Union, the entire Western Hemisphere, Australia, Japan, and Korea, and some other outliers, but that would essentially be the American realm, and we wouldn't have to bother with the boogeyman of Eurasia. In other words, Spikeman, I don't think operates today effectively.
Ukraine and Russia. The negotiations right now don't really exist. Both sides have delivered maximum demands on their memos. We're told that the G7 coming up and then the meeting of NATO and Europe is going to address whether or not to sustain Ukraine for another year. It looks now as if the hawks have the loudest voice, and they will. At the same time,
Right.
the additional new war in Eurasia, Iran, introduces the suggestion that working with Russia is necessary. Suggestion.
Well,
Certainly,
it's more than a suggestion, because in the last couple days, Mr. Putin and Mr. Trump have spent an hour on the phone. So obviously there is a connection.
you identify what I'm fetching, because according to the readout, they spend more time on Iran than they did on Ukraine.
Oh,
And-
yeah. Oh, yeah.
and begin to see Ukraine as, well, it's like a Balkans war in 1911, riding around with their beautiful white horses, and as a predicate to the big war that was coming, but not vital for, at the time, for any of the powers. Does Ukraine present a vital piece of the puzzle, or is Ukraine something that no longer works for the powers, is the question.
Well, if you look at Russia from, again, Mackinder's standpoint, if you want to be atavistic about it, Russia has been pushed way back. Russia was much further into Europe under the Tsars. It controlled much of Poland, including Warsaw, and now it's been pushed way back. Even Stalin's Russia before World War II had more territory in Ukraine. My sense is that there's no reason that we should be fighting over Ukraine, and in fact, Russia today is as a big power. I mean, it's a very powerful state, but it has a much smaller population than it did at the height of the Soviet Union, when Russia was actually bigger in terms of population than the United States. Today, Russia is about half the population of the US, and that's being charitable. You'd have to include Belarus and Kazakhstan. I mean, Russia it's not the kind of power that is going to threaten Europe, and it merely seeks to be a part of the kind of European order. And so I think we were chasing a will-o'-the-wisp in geopolitical terms by trying to bring down Russia.
Let me try a quick analogy that you just suggested to me. Germany invades Poland, September 1939. 2 weeks later, Russia invades Poland, Soviet Union, 1939. Britain is under extreme assault through 40, once the phony war turns hot, invasion of the Low Countries. Churchill comes in after the Norway fiasco, where he does not get blamed for his plan. But in any event, he comes back in. At this point, Britain is expecting an invasion, Operation Sea Lion, at any moment. The summer passes of 1940. They survive. And now the question is, do we ignore that Soviets invaded Poland and make a deal with them? And the answer is yes, we do. Does that look like bloody-minded enough for President Trump and President Putin to ignore the invasion of Ukraine, make a deal, and turn their attention to the Middle East?
Well, you brought up one of the great volte-faces of the 20th century. I mean, Britain and France, during the Winter War, where the Soviets invaded Finland, Britain and France were ready to strike at the Soviet Union's oil infrastructure in Baku. They had air forces
Right.
ready to bomb. So, but then they turned around under Churchill, and suddenly, our allies, the Soviets, and Britain was expending extraordinary energy and effort to resupply the Russians through Murmansk, which cost thousands and thousands of British lives. So, I mean, sure. I mean, we're not in exactly the same situation, but there is absolutely no reason for the U.S. not to have a concordat with Russia. And it would help us in many, many ways, including having another intermediary to try and help us extricate ourselves from the Middle East.
Is it too realpolitik for the editorial boards of the various newspapers?
They don't know anything about the world as it is, and they don't count for anything. They are irrelevant. I mean, they may have nice printed pages, with NYT on them, but they are absolutely not the power that they used to be. The media is done. It's cooked.
So we bring out the Uncle Joe posters and we go for it. Okay.
Well, I don't see why not. I mean, Trump has gone way beyond where Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin never got along, unlike Stalin and FDR, who got along famously. But I mean, the fact that there is an actual working relationship between the emperor in Washington and the emperor in Moscow is a very good thing.
We'll turn to a consideration of democracy next. It's much in the news. Vladimir Putin is not a man who represents democracy, and according to American observers, President Trump is not a man who recognizes democracy, and we will discuss. This is Germanicus and Gaius in Londinium. We've enjoyed ourselves with analogies of the present condition. Eurasian wars are tumbling. Is this a predicate for a larger war? We've got a larger war. Question is, what is the American place in it, or in settling some of it? When we come back, we'll ask the question about this demonstration over these last days called, bluntly, No Kings. This is the Friends of History Debating Society on a beautiful spring evening by the Thames. I'm John Batchelor. This is the Friends of History Debating Society. I'm Gaius. Germanicus is here. We're in our favorite wine bar by the Thames. It's Londinium, 91 AD, springtime. The Centurions are still here because they're drinking sweet wine. We're headed to the theater later. Right now, we enjoy observing the 21st century and irony everywhere. Within these last hours, hard to believe for Romans who look for a strong emperor. Hard to believe. We do not have a strong emperor right now. We have a man who's frightened of the Senate, and well, he might be, Domitian. However, we look to the future. Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, the Aurelians, and then chaos. However, turning to the 21st century, there's been, in these last hours, a very popular enterprise called No Kings. I didn't know what it was at first. I thought it was referring to a sports contest. But it turns out what it is a demonstration by American citizens and other countries against the idea of, I suppose, kingship, although they probably closer mean tyranny. But they did say king, so I'll stay with their word, no kings. Now, the king, supposedly, as I understand it, according to the posters I was seeing carried in these large festive crowds on a beautiful sunny day in many of the cities in the United States, Los Angeles included, even for a moment stepping aside from its violent activities in the street to look sunny and happy in California. If I understand it, they're referring to President Trump. And I'm not going to say any more other than to ask Germanicus. Germanicus, my memory is that President Trump was elected by a majority of the Electoral College. That's necessary. But by a majority of the voters as well, which isn't necessary, but this time it's a fact. He also won all the so-called swing states and enjoyed a popularity that he could never have imagined in his first term. Now, according to the American Constitution, as I read it, that makes him elected by a democracy. And to say that the democracy is in trouble is odd to me, especially when you consider that the people who are protesting lost the contest. They just lost. That's all. Now, the twist here is no kings. We recognize that Donald Trump, that the presidency of the United States has become the leading figure in an empire, hence emperors. What is it about the protesters that objects to a strong-minded emperor who's been elected by a democracy? Is this a democracy I don't recognize? Is this a use of the word democracy that is new?
To use the popular cliche of most commentators today, there's a lot to unpack. The first is, in the words of a former vice president, what you just said is an inconvenient fact, and yet we've come to the place where facts no longer matter, where Daniel Patrick Moynihan's adjuration that everyone is entitled to their opinions but not to their own facts, that's out the window. And maybe that's the real Overton window that has shifted, is that people can lie if they have power and if they have a mouthpiece, and it doesn't matter. So first of all, the United States is a republic. Rome is a republic, and republics are not democracies. And if you look at the actual democracies in city-states like Athens, well, they were not very nice democracies in many ways. So republics do not get succeeded by kings, because kingship is a hereditary form of monarchy, and it is absolutely out the window. And the fact is that the closest America came to kings was with the dynasts that were emerging in the form of the two Bushes, and then the putative successor to Mr. Clinton, which was Mrs. Clinton. I mean, that has been rejected by the American people. We live in a world in which the kind of republic we had in centuries past, and we can say that in the plural now, has been superseded, just as the Roman Republic was, by an empire. And it must be kept in mind always that the Roman Empire never discarded the institutions of the Republic. And to Romans, it was not an empire. After all, imperator means general. No one thought of Rome as being an empire. They thought of it as a res publica. And in fact, it was required on the accession of each new emperor that the people and the Senate acclaim him, or he was not legitimate. And that was true all the way to the end of the Roman Empire in 1453. So the people of the United States, in that narrow sense of acclamation, did indeed raise Mr. Trump to be emperor. And another point that needs to be made is that the imperial office that has evolved out of the former republic is an office that goes all the way back, say, to Woodrow Wilson, or certainly to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And in the Cold War and its exigency of an endless, eternal national emergency elevated American presidents to the same high place that Roman emperors held. And in that regard, Roman emperors, we have to remember, were not absolute rulers. They had many limitations, and they needed to keep both the people and the Senate happy, or they would be overthrown, just like our perhaps once beloved Domitian has lost the love and is now in some deep trouble. Well, that has happened again and again in Roman history, and it is now the world that we inhabit. So, yes, we have an imperial system because the size of America and its commitments and the enormous weight of America's presence in the world has changed us. We can't act like a city state anymore. And so, yeah, we have an empire. And those people who are complaining about no kings, which to me sounds like draft kings, in other
Yeah.
words, a sports betting franchise, that holds no weight. It's a pathetic slogan. It's a bad moniker. It's a cheap soundbite. It doesn't sink in. This isn't about kings. And by the way, just to add to that, um, George III wasn't the problem in the American Revolution. It was the British Parliament that was imposing the tyranny, not George III. George III wanted reconciliation with the colonies, but that he got tarred, as it were, tarred and feathered, because he was a convenient um, sort of figurehead, a kind of lightning rod that worked well as a symbol. But the truth of the matter is, kingship has nothing to do with it. I was talking to a dear friend who is a remarkably decorated veteran who still works in government, and I met him for lunch, and he said, "Well, Trump is never going to leave office," in his words. And I looked at him and I thought, really? Really? And I think that in many ways, what we're seeing is the expression and representation of a kind of wish fulfillment on the part of, for want of a better expression, the deep state, meaning all of the commanding heights in American life that used to run America and certainly ran it in the period of the Cold War, being dispossessed by the popular will. So the reality is it's not a king that we have to worry about. We have to worry about the angst and kind of bitterness of those who had thought that they could run America forever. So it's really a lot like those latter times in the Roman Republic, where you had the ruling class being disaccommodated. The optimates no longer have all of the power to run the state. And that they express that in a kind of rebellion. And what you're seeing is a rebellion by the optimates. And therefore, they're going to go against whatever the populist leader is. And today he is Mr. Trump.
Germanicus speaks of empire. It's another topic we need to go to because there have been suggestions that the Americans have the power, a first-rate power on the earth, and that they can express that power by supporting Ukraine, by supporting Israel, by supporting democracies around the world, by fending off the aggression of the villains, the revisionist states. When we come back, what about limits of empire? Do they exist? I am Gaius. This is Londinium, 91 AD. We're enjoying ourselves speculating about the 21st century. And when we come back, we'll deal with what we know of our empire between about 30 BCE to about 480 AD, the heart of the Roman army. I'm John Batchelor. This is the Friends of History Debating Society. I'm Gaius with Germanicus in our wine bar by the Thames. It's 91 AD. We can see the 21st century, not much farther than that, but we can see in the intervening centuries in between. And Germanicus has agreed that we speak to the first, second, third, especially the third, fourth, and perhaps a little of fifth. No, we'll stay with just the fourth, when the troubles realized themselves and Roman Britain was abandoned. However, we're here in the first century Roman Britain, and there's rosy days ahead. That's good. However, limits of empire. The subject comes up often because the question is, will the emperor raise another army? Will he send the legions here and there, running here and there? What about the Danube? What about the Rhine? Do they become the limits of the Roman Empire? The Black Sea, for example, Mauritania, outer Spain, lesser Spain. Looking at the American Empire might be a way to make this point better because the geography is more familiar. Germanicus, limits of empire. It's a good thing to recognize your limits. The Roman army dominated. The estimate is maybe there were 400,000 in the army, and the army and navy were interchangeable. So 400,000 military men maintained at one point at the height of the empire. It cost an enormous amount of money. That's what the tax money went for. However, I'm told that in order to build the roads that made the empire so successful cost more than all the armies for 500 years. So
Possibly.
our major infrastructure investment was the defense of the empire. You could get from Rome to Antioch in 40 days less than if you didn't have those roads. And that was everything for the army. However, limits of empire. We recognize our limits. We were always crashing our heads against the Parthians or the Persians or something out there in Mesopotamia. And we were equally always crashing our heads against the Germanic tribes on the Rhine or the Dacians on the Danube. And then the desert of the Sahara was a natural limit to the south. Egypt we had. Now, I mention all this because that's the greatest empire the solar system has ever known, the Roman Empire. For the time, it dominated everything in between, and the army maximum 33 legions, maybe mostly 30. Now, the Americans, they have a magnificent military. It has different services, but we'll say altogether magnificent, and it's performed very well for the last 100 years. Very well, everywhere it's gone. The politics of where it's gone are another matter, but the performance of the military has been first rate. But that doesn't mean that it can project power beyond its limits. And Germanicus, what are the limits of the American Empire? Does it help for the Americans to be reminded that they're outside of their ability to deliver authority? For example, I ask, is the Persian Gulf outside of the American Empire? Is Taiwan outside of the American Empire? How do you see it, Germanicus?
Well, you raise wonderful connections between three huge empires that we feel close to. One is Rome, one is the British Empire in the 19th century, and the other is the U.S. today. And the truth that connects all three of them is that during the height of empire, or the imperial impetus, that is to say, the forward movement to go further and to expand more, is very similar. And all three empires, A, didn't recognize their limits, and B, were living in the moment. All three of them expanded in large part because they'd go into one place that was giving them trouble or threatening, and then there would be another threat right beyond that, and they'd keep going and keep going. So Britain, for example, ended up with 1/6 of the landmass of the world. Rome, of course, had a gigantic realm, and so does the United States today. And what's interesting, again, comparing the U.S. to Rome, is that the American military is about the same size as the Roman. You said the Romans had about 400,000. Well, their empire was about 100 million people. So you scale that up to the size of the U.S., and that's the size of the U.S. military, something like 1.4, 1.5 million. That is very similar to Rome, and it was a skin of your teeth exercise. The lowest Rome ever went was like 28 legions, but even at 33, that was not enough. And it was clearly not enough when things began to change beyond the Roman frontiers. But as I said, like Britain and like the US today, Rome did not understand the limits of empire until they came crashing down on the Romans. And so the Romans did not stop moving into Germania until they lost 3 legions in a really savage defeat. And Rome in the east, for example, could never occupy or pacify Mesopotamia. They could the upper Mesopotamia and the Tigris and Euphrates, but they couldn't take the heart of what had been Persia. And even in the south, sure, there were the deserts in Mauritania, but Roman expeditions got way into Nubia and where Ethiopia is. But those were not areas the Romans could or wanted to pacify. The same with northern Scotland. And the U.S. has pushed itself, like Rome and like the British, to the place or point where it was occupying things that were of no value whatsoever, and in fact were like albatrosses. So the U.S. maintained its position in Afghanistan thanks to Mr. Putin and Russia, who allowed the U.S. to bring supplies all the way through Russia to keep the Afghan effort going. And it's a lot like the British, who went into Afghanistan 3 separate times with armies, one of which they lost. And it was too far. It was, a bridge too far. And so the U.S. has natural limits. And one further point that needs to be made is that the height of the British Empire, the American Empire, and the Roman Empire was not when they reached their greatest extent, namely that there were Romans on the Elbe River, or Romans for 3 or 4 years under Trajan in Mesopotamia. That was the overextension. The same is true of Britain in Afghanistan and other places like Iraq or Palestine. And the same is true of the U.S. today, not only in Iraq and Afghanistan, very similar places to Rome and Britain, but also an overextension that we're feeling now. We do not have the military capacity to dominate the world any longer. And the only reason that we were able to do so from 1991 until very recently is that there were no real rivals or contenders. And now we have China, which with a truly gigantic fleet, newer and bigger than ours, and 230 times the shipbuilding capability. We do not occupy a position where we can maintain a perimeter like a garrote around China through Taiwan. And we were not able to push Russia back and bring Russia down. They have triumphed in Ukraine. And we're in the same situation potentially in the Middle East, which we can only hope we can extricate ourselves from before true disaster strikes in a war with Iran. And these are all very Roman-like situations. In other words, to us, Gaius, they're intensely familiar. We have walked that road before.
And recognizing limits means that we have some sense of our own authority in the
Yes.
we do dominate. And I believe that to be accurate. I just want to check here. We dominate Latin America. Dominate. It's all the dollar is the conversation, no matter what alliances are made. We dominate Western Europe. Eastern Europe, there are question marks. But Western Europe, we dominate. We certainly dominate Australia, the Philippines, and Japan. South Korea has political moments, but we could say that we have a lot of friends in South.
Oh, they're totally dependent on us.
That's a big empire, Germanicus.
It's completely big, and it has, look, just look at a map. It has the entire Pacific and the entire Atlantic Oceans. You don't need anything more than that.
Do we recognize it?
No, we're stupid. We need to focus on defending what we have and building up, not to go to war with China, but building up our Navy to be able to protect the realm that we have. And it's a fabulous realm, and it's going to need protecting because the rest of the world will remain fractious and will be in situations we don't like. But the worst thing that we're doing now has in the past 3 years been Ukraine, but right now and for decades past, it is the Middle East. And we really need to extricate ourselves from the Middle East before we get stuck in a terrible war that will lead to our imperial defeat. We do not want to be Julian, Julian the Apostate, before the gates of Tisfan in 363 being defeated.
Next time, remind me, Germanicus, we must speak of the 3rd century. The Americans don't know what chaos is. They really don't.
No,
So,
it can happen. It comes. And when it comes, man, you're in deep shiza.
yes,
Excuse me.
those were the days. Germanicus is Michael Vlahos. I am Gaius, John Batchelor. This is the Friends of History Debating Society in Londinium. We're headed to the theater. We can only hope there's a comedy tonight. There, I checked on the way down to the wine bar, and there was no announcement. It didn't say they were closed tonight. None of that. There was no announcement. So it might be amateur players. Sometimes they let people act out scenes. We don't know. It's always entertaining. And yes, we will sacrifice to the great god Augustus, our founding emperor. I'm John Batchelor.